and welcome to the debate. I'm your host Sana Maqbool with you at PTV World, as always, bringing you stories from around the world and also from within Pakistan, and of course trying to give you angles and different perspectives so that you are able to form a well-informed opinion about different stories. Today's show will be talking about two very important stories. One of them is related to Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan, which of course has ended the ceasefire. We know that the government and the TTP came into an agreement last month, and now we know that the TTP had announced that they're going to be ending the ceasefire, and following that we've also seen two deadly attacks allegedly from the TTP also taking place with reference to the polio vaccination workers, and we also know that security personnel have been martyred in these attacks. And now of course this is an organization that the government has been trying to deal with in different ways in the past as well, and we've seen that negotiations for the TTP and the government have been going on as well, and the government is trying to look at many different options to different groups of the TTP who will be willing to follow the constitutions and go forward. Regardless of that, we have seen that these attacks have taken place, the ceasefire has ended, and the government has made it very clear that it has a clear policy on how to deal with the terrorist groups, and also the fact that they have fought the TTP in the past and can do so in the future as well. Of course, this puts into question as to what really is going to be the strategy moving forward, and how does the government plan to deal with the TTP altogether, also with a threat emerging from Afghanistan. We'll also be in the show looking at the situation in India. We know that after the demise of the Chief of Defence Staff in India, there is some sort of a confusion over who is going to be taking the slot of the CDS from now on. We're trying and explore exactly what the procedure and criteria for this post is, who can be the possible candidates for this particular slot, and who will be the decision-making body in this regard, and what sort of factors can be taken into account and the impact that it will have on the overall future of the Indian military and the government. With reference to this development, we will also be taking a look at the fact that suicides within the Indian Army continue to grow. We've talked about this in previous shows as well, how even very senior personnel of the Indian Armed Forces have committed suicide, specifically in regions of Jammu and Kashmir, and we've talked about in detail the kind of pressure that of course is there at the Indian government personnel and the armed forces personnel, and what really is the matter with the Indian government in terms of how it looks at these personnel and whether or not there is something to be done about it. We'll explore both of these topics in further detail with of course our respected guests, and as usual we have in the studio with me Mr. Farrukh Pitafi and Raja Faisal. Thank you very much for joining us, gentlemen, once again. We're also going to be joined. Thank you very much, Farrukh. We're also going to be joined by experts online as well. I will be introducing you to them as soon as they join us in the show. Starting off, of course, when we look at the situation with the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan, Faisal, I'm going to start with you, considering what we've discussed before as to how the government, of course, wants to be able to bring different groups who are willing to follow the constitution at the negotiating table, and has always tried to move forward with peace and dialogue. However, we've seen that the ceasefire was ended and these attacks took place. Now, do you think that this calls for a major change in the strategy in the way that the government plans to deal with the TTP?
Sana, first of all, welcome back. You were missing and we were missing you as well.
Thank you, Faisal.
The very first thing I want to say in this context is that the government had a clear stance since the day one. And what government wanted to give a chance to the peace, and still is willing to. But if somebody wants to engage in the war with the government, then of course the government would never allow anyone to portray as a state within a state. And the areas which Pakistan is concerned about, of course TTP is actively engaging with the terrorist activities, and government will never allow it. But now question for me here is that there are certain statements which are coming from few of the factions of Afghan Taliban as well, who are considering TTP as same like them. And in recent days, what we've been seeing is that a few of their lower cadres, like tier 4, tier 5 people, they were engaged in different debates, and they did say that they don't endorse Pakistan's government, the Taliban sitting in Afghanistan. See, this is what Pakistan has always maintained. Pakistan kept on saying, and world kept on blaming Pakistan for being behind Taliban, Afghan Taliban I'm talking about, while Pakistan kept on saying that we have nothing to do with Afghan Taliban. And this is evident now that Pakistan maintained the right position, and Pakistan never endorsed Afghan Taliban in previous times. All Pakistan wants is peace in Afghanistan, because if peace is endorsed and in place in Afghanistan, then of course Pakistan's Western concerns can be dealt with. But I think it's about the world powers. They need to understand that whatever Pakistan is wanting in Afghanistan is just the stability, economic stability, security stability. Pakistan wants a peaceful Afghanistan, and that's it. So that in future TTP cannot do any kind of activities in Pakistan as well.
Right, Faisal, let me also introduce our guests who have joined us on Skype on telephone line. We've been joined by journalist Gohar Masood, and we've also been joined by the President Fatah Research Center, Islamabad, Mr. Saifullah Khan. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for joining us in the show. I'll start with you, Mr. Saifullah. Considering the fact that we have seen that the TTP, of course, is a major concern for Pakistan, and with reference to that, the situation in Afghanistan is also very important to us. As Faisal was talking about earlier, we also understand that the internal assessment regarding Pakistan and Afghanistan is pointing towards the fact that maybe the international community, particularly the US, is not going to be able to fulfill the kind of commitments or pursue Afghanistan and Taliban regime the way that they need to be doing at the moment in order to avert a kind of crisis which is not going to be good for us. With the fact that we know that the TTP now, of course, is also posing a renewed threat, and the situation in Afghanistan getting worse, how does Pakistan play its part in terms of being able to balance this equation at the moment?
Saifullah Saab, can you hear us? There seems to be some communication problem.
Mr. Saifullah, maybe perhaps you can try to unmute yourself. We can't hear you.
No, he's not speaking.
Yeah.
I think there seems to be a technical problem. Yeah. I'm going to pose the same question to you, Mr. Gohar. Are you able to hear me? I think we may not be able to get in touch with our guest. Yes, Mr. Gohar, can you hear me?
Yeah, I do, but missing some voices. I can't hear.
Our voice is breaking.
Mr. Gohar, your voice is breaking, but I'm going to repeat the question and try and see if we can hear you properly. What I was referring to is, of course, the situation in Afghanistan and Pakistan's concern amid the situation where we see that the international community, with particular reference to the US, seems to be losing interest or is not able to follow the situation as urgently as Pakistan think it requires to do so. With the TTP also posing an emergent threat in the country and the situation of Afghanistan deteriorating, what's the next step for Pakistan?
What I understood a question about the TTP, current act of the TTP region and in the Khyber Pass. Yes, since is like the last week, the TTP has carried out some dangerous attacks on the whole US. The 2 weeks, in just 3 days, they have killed a officer and some workers. Sunday, another targeting in Waziristan. A shopkeeper went to his shop and he was killed. Similarly, in some other tribal parts, areas, there are many, these targetings. So TTP active again coming rise and up. So people in the areas scared of the situation, and it's on and it's raising up. Especially today, TTP has also there is a statement. They have nominated different charge Peshawar and Pakhtunkhwa districts, they will, capture, they will run the system. PTP is running the operation in 2014. So they have once again dominated cabinet kind of that their system. So the TTP is trying to reunite and establish stop their system in the region.
Right, right. Mr. Gore, we'll come back to you to continue the discussion, Farrukh. First, but help me understand one thing. We of course know that there was an agreement between the TTP and the government. The TTP of course claims that the terms of the agreement were not followed through by the government, and which is why they have announced the end of the ceasefire. Is there something the government could have done differently?
Right. I just want to know, because this is not the first time it has happened. This is not our first rodeo. There have been 17 rounds of talks since 9/11 with these factions, right? We know that from Shakai and Sararoha to Mian Nawaz Sharif's time, and now we have been engaging them repeatedly in talks. And every time there are two patterns that emerge. One, they try to engage the government, but simultaneously they regroup and they organize, and then they start attacking again. When they do, they start claiming that the government was the one that was faulty, that was not actually adhering to the agreement. So this
is just part of the pattern.
Yeah, it is part of the pattern, unless you want to think that we are going to be 18th time lucky, right? Didn't happen. Regarding what TTP has been doing and what their worldview is, I can understand the bit about reintegration or mainstreaming regarding the foot soldiers. But when you talk about their major cadres, their cadres, I have serious doubt that you can any time reabsorb them without punishing them, because these are the people who groomed others, who went and killed so many people.
Okay.
And secondly, whenever you have talks, there is a problem of scope as well. When the state of Pakistan is going to talk to somebody, it understands that eventually, if agreement holds, they are going to forgive a lot of people. That includes murderers. But my point of view is, although constitutionally the state can do it, but should it? Because the moral imperative tells us that 80,000 people that were killed, hundreds of thousands of people who were maimed, injured, their lives destroyed, they should have a say. Not the politicians, not the state of Pakistan, but the people who have been direct victims of it, right? So I thought from the day one that it is not going anywhere. We have an argument that we keep on actually making. We try to actually draw parallels between Afghanistan and Pakistan. I don't want to go there, but frankly, the US, Afghan territory is not US territory. They had no skin in the game. When they left, they did not turn back and look again, right? And Taliban took over. This is our territory. We cannot abdicate our state institutions to these monsters.
Right.
So eventually, I think this is what was going to happen. And now, because the Afghan Taliban are in Afghanistan, this time we had to do it because they thought that give peace a chance. We did. But in the end, you have seen what the TTP has done, and then you must have seen the story where Afghan Taliban are saying that TTP is not part of us.
Right.
So now you see that there is going to be some kind of action on both sides of the border.
Mr. Saifullah Khan, President Fatah Research Center Islamabad, has also joined us once again on Skype. Welcome to the show. Sir, can you hear me?
Thank you. Yeah, I can hear you now.
Right. So earlier we were discussing that this, of course, is not the first round of talks. And as Farrukh was saying, similar things have happened in the past from the TTP side, which, of course, also points to the fact that perhaps similar things have also been done from the government side. If that is so, do we not require a change in strategy? We've seen that the government has given a response on how they're very clear on how to deal with groups or parties that have extremist or terrorist backgrounds. But then what sort of a clarity is there if there seems to be no going forward?
I think we will have to be patient with regard to our negotiations with the TTP. We'll have to give it more time. We'll have to Uh, we shouldn't be hasty about it.
Okay.
Once we have taken this path, it is, I think, prudent to stay the course. And, these kind of negotiations are not going to be resolved in a day or two, as is evident to us, during the last month of ceasefire. Of course, that ceasefire was, I mean, talking from the point of view of the people of the tribal areas, former tribal areas, the ones that we call the newly merged districts now. I mean, this peace was good for them. I mean, these people have been living, suffering war for the last 20 years, and this was kind of a respite to them. Life was able to resume, a little bit normally as compared to before. So we have to be patient, and now that we have engaged the Afghan Taliban as mediators, in our negotiations with the TTP, we'll have to give it time, and at the same time, we will have to be mindful of the nature of the negotiations that will take place with them. Let us be honest, these are essentially Pashtun militant groups. Of course, there is an element of Punjabi Taliban also that is part of the TTP, but by and large, these are Pashtun militant groups, and the mediators too. I'm referring to the Afghan Taliban are also Pashtuns. So Pashtun Wali will have a big part to play, and for that to happen, there has to be, we have to be patient, and we have to be very, very careful. We have to be mindful of our obligations as part of these negotiations as well. The Taliban, as we know, have accused the Pakistani side of not having honored the agreement that was reached
Right.
as part of the ceasefire. So, so there is a lot of things that are involved here. We have to be
Faisal,
patient.
you have a
Yeah,
question?
yeah. Brother Saifullah, I wanted to ask you a question. As we know, it is understandable that Haqqani network was, guarantor in these talks, and they want peace in Pakistan as well, and they want Pakistan's government to have talks with the TTP. Now, what kind of role we can see coming from them in coming future? Do we see that they will play a significant role in coming days?
Look, given their past relationship with the TTP, I mean, this is no secret, the kind of relationship they had with the TTP. TTP hosted them in our former tribal areas for a very long time. And then, when the TTP crossed over into Afghanistan, although, there were reports that perhaps, India and the Afghan regime under Ashraf Ghani was also, instrumental in hosting TTP there. But at the same time, they had cooperation with the Afghan Taliban as well. So, given that past relationship between the TTP and the Haqqani network and the Afghan Taliban, they can play a significant role. But as I said, we have to be very careful with how we go forward with this. Because, as I said, these are essentially Pashtuns, and Pashtun Wali, and the way negotiations are held under the Pashtun Wali code, that has to be that will play a very important role, and as a party to the negotiations, we
Right.
have to be mindful of that, and our obligations under that
Saifullah
code,
Masood sahab,
when
sorry
we
to cut you.
engage. When,
You are sorry to cut you. Like twice you have actually used these three terms actually. One, Pashtun Wali, and then you have
yeah.
also mentioned that most of them are Pashtuns, and eventually you also spoke about our commitments. But sir, with due respect, in the past 20 years, when these
Yeah.
people were actually killing Pakistani innocents, including Pashtuns, and majority of them Pashtuns,
Sure,
do you
sure.
think that they followed that Pashtun Wali code?
What they did, see, I mean, the previous negotiations that we have held with them, I mean, if you look at the history of that, the accusations have been from both sides. Maybe, well,
Sir,
our side
sir,
says that perhaps the
our
Taliban did not.
experience is that
Yeah,
we have been dying. I've butted my own friends.
I'm sorry, say again.
I'm saying that you were saying that both sides keep on blaming each other, but with due
Yeah.
respect, sir, our side of the bargain or situation is that we have experienced it. We have, most of us have butted our friends literally with our own hands.
Oh, so have they. So have they. Let's be honest here. I mean, you cannot just blame one side and say that all the fault lies with one side. I mean,
Sir,
we talk about all the atrocities that took place in Pakistan, 70,000 dead. It's an extremely difficult decision for Pakistan, to enter into negotiations with them. But for the sake of peace, especially in the NMDs, people that have suffered war for the last 20 years, we have
All right, Mr.
swallowed.
Saifullah, let me also include Mr. Gohar in the discussion. Mr. Gohar, we of course know that the government, of course, is looking towards peace and dialogue and has always opted for that solution in terms of its negotiations with any party or group. But of course, we also know that they've been talking about how they want to be able to negotiate with a few groups that, of course, are willing to follow the constitution. How exactly do you think that this demarcation is taking place?
Well, Sana, first of all, I would say that the Taliban are not based on the nationality. They are doing what they are doing on the basis of religion or their own thoughts. I would say that the peace talks between government and the TTP, I don't know what were the reasons that they came on these peace talks when the Taliban were about to eliminate, when they were about to end, because the Taliban had no such place to make themselves regroup or something like that. If the Afghan Taliban are sincere with the Pakistan, the current Afghan government is sincere with the Pakistan, then what were the reasons to bring the Taliban on the peace talks and give them a space? I'm sorry, I can't understand this situation. But the thing is, if they are coming on this position to make a peace deal with the Taliban or TTP, then they have to make it clear. Last time we saw some news on the media that some Pakistani officials are saying that we are releasing some Taliban guys, but on the ground we haven't seen any such thing. And the same when the Taliban are claiming that Pakistan is not sincere in the peace talks, and they are doing nothing according to the peace talks we have talked about. So I would say the peace talks can be successful when the both parties are very sincere. Here I can see some tactics between the both sides. On one side, TTP got time to make them regroup and strong and penetrate in the tribal areas and Pakistan's different districts. But on the other side, after 1 month, they are announcing that Pakistan is not sincere with us. And the Pakistani authorities are just sitting silent. This is something like a big question mark, because the tribal areas, the people in the tribal areas, they are in a very difficult and different situation.
Right. Okay, Mr. Kaur, so what of course we have to do is, of course, try and understand what exactly do we need to do moving forward. Farrukh, something earlier you said, of course, regarding the families and the people who've actually been the direct victims of these terrorist attacks by the TTP in the past need to be involved in the kind of decision making in terms of how to move forward with them. Can you also explain exactly how that sort of can be formed into a tangible step forward? Really, what exactly are we looking at? How do we group these people together and get their opinion on board, and then what sort of action are we looking at?
Right. I think that is very important, because Pakistan seems to have a problem with documentation as well. We haven't seen any elaborate list of people who are victims or relatives of victims. But first of all, allow me to actually clarify one point. I respect Saifullah Masood Saab's point of view, and I'm sure that he actually hails from that area, so he would understand it better. But I have, as a journalist, covered this from corner to corner, right? And first of all, when you are talking about peace in the tribal areas, with due respect, TTP destroyed peace there. There was an elder Mashiran system. They killed everyone, right? And but then, of course, there was this reign of terror that continued for as long as there was no operation or action against them. I remember those places, those caves where people used to be hung in groups, in droves, right? Hakimullah Masood and then Fazlullah also did this. Frankly, there's no both-sidism. One side is an evil terrorist organization, the other side is a state, and then the other side includes people who have been killed, and they were innocent citizens who died because of no fault of their own, right? So there's no both-sidism here. Regarding who is going to forgive and who is going to do what, frankly, first of all, the first act of forgiveness starts when there is some kind of penitence, when you see your flaw, when you see your fault. Have you seen any statement coming from TTP that might actually telegraph to you that they have changed their outlook or their worldview or their rhetoric at least? They haven't.
But Farrukh, what do you propose then? What does the government do?
Look, basically, my solution is simple. I didn't start this war. I'm a peaceful man. I have never killed even a sparrow. But frankly, if you have started a war, I would like to see it going to its logical end, and that is not that far off. But if there is going to be actually any kind of forgiveness, then the state of Pakistan has to first identify the victims, then consult them individually, and seek their permission, and then forgive whosoever they want.
Yeah,
Okay,
I just wanted to add something. You know, it's understandable that when now from everywhere we are seeing that everyone wants to move on with the peace. As Brother Saif was saying, that fair enough, you know, there were damages on the both sides, so we need to move on. But as Brother Gohar was earlier mentioning, that there is a lack of trust from the both sides. I want to ask Brother Saifullah Masood that if there is a lack of trust from both sides, then who is the one who can play the role to mend that trust? Brother Saif.
Maybe I
We're
was not
unable to
able
hear you, Mr.
Yeah,
Saifullah.
we can,
Perhaps.
we can.
Can I?
Yes,
Can
go
I
ahead.
please? Can I please make my point here?
Yes,
Yes,
go
sure.
ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much. So my point was either I was not able to explain myself properly or perhaps my point was not understood properly. What I am saying when I refer to Pashtunwali again and again, what I mean to say is that either you don't hold negotiations with them and go for the option of war and bring it to a logical conclusion. This will take time. The people of the tribal area will suffer more, maybe for 2, 3, 4 years, because that is not going to be easy. 6 to 8,000 Taliban fighting them, and the war theater, frankly, would be the NMDs, the newly merged districts. That is where the war will take place, and there will be more sufferings for the people. That is why Pakistan opted for peace in the first place. That is one. Secondly, but once if you are going for negotiations, then Pashtunwali has to be there. Pashtunwali has to be kept in mind while you hold negotiations with the Taliban. That is why I'm saying they are Pashtuns, and the people that are mediating on our behalf, on their behalf, the Afghan Taliban, they are Pashtuns too. So all the principles that apply to negotiations under the Pashtunwali Code, those principles will apply to these negotiations. There will be nobody will seek any pardon from anyone. If you have to hold negotiations, keep in mind that all the Taliban, there will be nobody will be going to jail. You won't place blame at anyone. All the blames will have to be forgiven and forgotten. Whatever has
Right.
happened of course, you can always ask them to
Saifullah
come
sir,
under the constitution. That is a
right.
legitimate point that
Saifullah sir,
Pakistan can
when
make
you were
with them.
talking about Pashtunwali, again, I have to do it because my point is not that this is not a code or it shouldn't apply. My humble submission is that in the past they have shown that Afghan Taliban don't care about Pashtunwali. How do you think they are going to start doing it now?
Pashtuns, whether they care about, whether they take the name of Islam or anything, to further their political agenda, the fact remains that they're Pashtuns. They were born to Pashtuns all their lives. They have conducted themselves personally and with each other socially,
Right, of
as
course,
per
we're
the
of course looking,
Pashtunwali Code.
we're of course looking
As
at
per
an
the
option that we
Pashtunwali Code,
have
so that
explored in
will
the past
apply.
as well. Right, Mr. Saifullah, we've seen this happen in the past as well, and of course this is something that we're trying to achieve once again, as discussed earlier. My last question would be to Mr. Gohar, considering of course the fact that whenever we talk about peace, we'll have to think about dialogue, and when we look at the other way, there is of course war, and there is growing uncertainty in Afghanistan as well, and there are chances of the terrorist groups of course regrouping as well. In that scenario, when we have the Taliban regime from Afghanistan playing the role of mediator and the instability increasing, and then us perhaps not opting for peace or dialogue, what sort of option does it really leave us? Can we really afford to go towards the logical end when we have this sort of uncertainty in the neighboring country?
Well, Sana, I would say that, since very beginning, we have started fight against the terrorism and Taliban. Since now we have lost a lot of lives a lot of the tribal people, houses and their properties, a lot of things. But now, we were about to succeed the militancy and terrorism and all these things. Here again, now we are on the point, shall we go to the peace process or not? There are some things like Taliban are saying we are fighting for Sharia. And on the other side, the Pakistan is saying that what the TTP is calling is not Sharia, but it's extremism. On the other side, the Afghan Taliban and Pakistan government has a good understanding and relation and context. So Pakistani government can utilize Afghan Taliban to moderate the TTP guys. Otherwise,
Okay.
the TTP guys are just stuck with their own ideology, and they are trying to impose their ideology in the society. So there could be no chance to a peace talk till that the TTP guys can moderate themselves.
All right. Thank you very much, Mr. Gohar Masood and Mr. Saifullah Khan, for joining us and giving us your detailed insight. Farrukh, yes, quickly, please.
Very quickly, just two humble submissions. Anybody who's actually examining or following this path, I'm not saying don't follow this path, please stop having this talk of both sidism. There's no both side. One is a terrorist group, the other is state of Pakistan. You cannot equate the two. And secondly, when you are talking about all these things that have gone on, please look at the pain of the people who have suffered also, and whether they are ready to forgive or not.
Absolutely.
My
This, of course,
my
is
last
what it was.
submission.
Yes,
My
Faisal.
last submission. The
More
only
good
logical end. The only logical end to any conflict is peace.
Or surrender.
Peace.
Or surrender.
No,
No, yeah, but one can surrender also.
All
I mean,
right,
we keep
all
on
right.
saying this, but with due respect, terrorist organizations, there are two examples that I can give you just now. Sri Lanka, till the time the other side didn't surrender, there was no peace. Then there is Northern Ireland case, where Northern Ireland, when they were going to go for armistice and peace, they actually held a referendum and they asked the people of Pakistan. Why do we keep on cutting the Taliban so much slack that we start thinking that perhaps the people who are opposing this idea, or perhaps pointing out the other side, are somehow enemies of peace? They are not.
when you have a porous
Perhaps
border.
we're talking about surrender and peace is one and the same thing. Thank you very much, Mr. Saifullah Khan and Gohar Masood, for joining us. I'm sorry we only have time to talk about this segment this much. We will have to move on to the second one, which of course is with regards to what's going on in India. After the demise of the CDS, General Bipin, we have seen that there is of course talk about who's going to fill the slot and what is going to be the next step forward for the Indian military. Faisal, before we move ahead, please help us understand exactly what is the procedure involved and the criteria involved and who gets to be the Chief of Defence Staff in India.
You know, Sana, it's obviously a new slot CDS India initiated for someone who was very close to BJP and RSS, lifelong member. The one we recently saw that he, passed away. He got killed in one of the crashes. Right now the situation is who can, place himself in his place, the CDS. The CDS slot can be covered by General Narwane. The talk of the town, the Delhi talk is right now that General Narwane might take over. And then who takes the COS position? And that might go towards Lieutenant General Mohanty, who happens to be,
Senior most general.
senior most, plus he happens to be Vice Chief of Army Staff as well, so he could take that place. But the question here is whether Narwane accepts that or not, because in 3-4 months he was about to get retired anyway, and he does not see CDS to be a slot that can be considered as a big slot after Chief of Army Staff.
Okay.
Why? Because if we look at the realities, I mean, CDS was given only 4 rooms in Department of Defense of Ministry of Defense, Raksha Mantral, as they call it, and it is something very derogatory for a CDS. Plus, CDS is the same person who had, while he was designing all of these theater commands, he had a row with the previous air chief. I'm talking about Bhaduria. Bhaduria, clearly said that if, I will never be considered, I will never allow anyone to consider my Air Force as just the under army or someone. We are a fighting arm and we have our own place. This is what was happening, and they had a proper row. And right now, looking at the facts, there are 2-3 people who could place themselves into CDS. Number one, Bhaduria, because he's under 65. Whoever is under 65 and has commanded one of the forces, he can be a CDS. And then we have Chief of Army Staff, Narwane. He can place himself there. But in this whole equation, I see someone who would suffer if Narwane becomes CDS and Janam Mohanty becomes the Chief of Army Staff. The only one who would be suffering is Eastern Commandant. We are talking about Lieutenant General Manoj Pandey, because he was Pandeyji was supposed to be the next Chief of Army Staff, which if Narwane becomes CDS, we won't see him.
Okay. Okay, let's also include Mr. Adil Farrukh Raja, geopolitical analyst in the discussion, who's also joined us online. Thank you very much for joining us. You had the discussion when what Faisal was talking about in terms of speculating who will be the new CDS in India. What do you think? Who are the possible candidates for this slot?
You see, Sana, the candidature list have been very aptly discussed by Raja Faisal already. I won't go there. But I've got a crib, Sana, that you keep very little time for important issues. You see, the thing is that I wrote an article about a year ago, which got published in The Nation. It was titled The War Within the Indian Establishment. It was about the first CDS, now late General Bipin Rawat, and the way he came to become the CDS. In fact, it was the RSS BJP Boys Club which decided to bring on a CDS out of the blue. And it was essentially because of the close coordination between the CDS, late CDS General Bipin Rawat, and the National Security Advisor, NSA Ajit Doval, who happens to be from the same area. So there was, you see, we call it in the military slang, we call it Dakhana Ka Milta Tha. So they developed close association amongst each other, and General Bipin Rawat, after being the army chief, became a CDS. But the CDS, as Raja Faisal rightly pointed out, did not have a command infrastructure to run Tri-Services command effectively. Unlike Pakistan, where we've got a chairman, Joint Chief of Staff Committee, who's got a Joint Services headquarters, which is carrying out the coordination amongst the Tri-Services. There was no infrastructure as such available. And yes, Raja Faisal was right that there was only 4 rooms available to him. But you see, because of the situation, this was a reward, by the way, for General Bipin Rawat for his compliance in the saffronization of the Indian armed forces. And you see, the leadership failure and the saffronization of Indian armed forces causes a suicide in the Indian armed forces every third day. A soldier dies in an incident of suicide or fratricide.
Yeah.
So going back to the CDS NSA duo, the war within the Indian establishment was calling for heads to roll. Why? Because the CDS and NSA kept presenting a rosy picture to the political leadership after the 2019 Abhi None Done episode, and later the shame in the Valley of Galwan, which they presented very aptly as, funningly, they presented it as some sort of victory, but 20 Indian soldiers got massacred. And all along, the CDS and NSA kept presenting a different picture from what picture was being presented by the army chief, General Narwane, to the political establishment. So later on, there was an inquiry in which the defense minister blamed the quoted General Bipin Rawat as saying that it was the army chief and his corps commander responsible for this, fiasco up in the north.
Right. Right. Farrukh, do you think that this current vacuum that we are seeing after the demise of General Bipin and what is going to follow is going to further point out the kind of holes that we're talking about within the military structure?
Right. I'm glad that you're asking me. I hope you will allow me some wiggle room, some time to actually talk about these things. No, in the previous one, I kept on actually jumping in. You were kind, but I still try to.
See, when you jump in, there's no need for me to allow you anymore.
Yeah, but this time I'm actually writing an application and requesting you
Great,
every time.
great.
In order to understand, in order to answer your question regarding General Bipin Rawat and whether there was any vacuum left by his death or not, you have to first look at who he was, what he represented, and what became of him, right? First of all, I believe that his position itself was a vacuum of power. It was created to subjugate Indian forces. Because Indian forces, whatever you may say, they're very disciplined and they have their own system, right? But BJP could not afford it. First, Bipin Rawat was promoted against turn. He was not the senior most person. He was brought in as the army chief. Although he's a decorated soldier, he was a son of a general as well. But I don't get this thirst of power where you actually start compromising the very institution that made you, right?
True.
General Bipin Rawat, his major contribution to India's well-being was his 2019 operation, Balakot and all, which actually helped Narendra Modi return to power. As a reward, he was kicked upstairs, and there was this new position that was created after he had retired. So essentially, he was a retired general, right? A retired general reassigned to a new office, and he actually donned 4 caps. One, principal advisor to the defense minister. The second one was CDS, as we call him. The third one was advisor to National Command Authority. And the fourth one, the most sinister one, was secretary the Department of Military Affairs. Why it was important? Because military affairs finances actually were routed through this. So he essentially controlled the purse strings of all 3 services. Hence, they had to follow his dictate as well. And remember that when everything was going on, a 4-star general in India actually retires at the age of 62. There's an age of superannuation is that. So what actually the TORs that were created, and do you know who wrote the TORs? It was Ajit Doval who actually wrote the TORs, and there was this haggling that went on. And then the General Saab got 3 years of extension. And how? Because then they wrote in those papers in his TOR that the retirement age of CDS will be 65. So, regarding his uniform also, his uniform was essentially totally improvised. It was not something that actually existed in India. I understand that in India there is a demand for theaterization and also for jointness. But when you talk about theaters and all these issues, you have to realize what was going on. In India, India has a big army. I understand they have the mobilization issues. But when something is working and you just pull it down and you demolish 17 commands to actually come up with 7, then you are creating such a mess at such a magnificent and humongous proportion that then coming generations will have a problem. So my problem is that CDS's office did not need to exist. Honestly, right now the media keeps on speculating who killed him. Frankly, this plane Mi-17 V5 actually fell 50 times in the past 15 years, right? It might be very safe, but it crashes. Planes crash. But with due respect, if you ask me who killed General, Bipin Rawat, had General Bipin Rawat not co-opted the system and actually cheated his own retirement, there was no need for him to be on this flight and he would not have crashed. So I think General Bipin Rawat killed himself.
Yeah, I wanted to ask another question from Major Adil. Major Adil, I understand that you have been writing extensively on the issue of suicides being committed within the Indian Army, especially when we talk about the Kashmir sector. They have been committing suicide. And today we were going through another story of 2 of the army personnel. One of them was a major, an officer in the Indian Army, they have committed suicide. What do you think? Is it something to do with the morale of the army that we are seeing declining, and what kind of psychological barriers they will be facing right now?
And let me also add, Mr. Adil, as you said earlier that a rosy picture was presented. Do you think that's part of the case right now, or is it just being ignored?
Thing Mr. Pitafi very rightly brought out the actual picture which was going on, the mess which was made by the CDS in order on the pretext of the modernization of Indian Armed Forces. It was all based on the misconception which was propagated by the ex-CDS and the NSA Ajit Doval, that India can fight a two-front war, whereas India simply does not have the capability to fight a two-front war. They simply do not have the capability to fight a single front war. They have not defeated Pakistan and West Pakistan to date, starting from 1947. And what happened with China is quite evident. So it was based on the misconception that India can fight a two-front war. So yes, the picture which was being painted was on misconception. Now, coming over to the question of Raja Faisal, you see, Raja Faisal, every third day, as a soldier of the Indian Armed Forces, including officers, they die in an incident of suicide or fratricide. Now, to me, normally I would say that it is the cost of running an apartheid over minorities by the Hindutva Raj. But at the same time, it is a leadership failure. Right? How come it's a leadership failure? You see, native officers are not allowed to command native units in India.
Right.
Can you imagine? After 1984 Sikh genocide, and after the killing of Indira Gandhi, after 1986, they passed a law that native officers, like, for example, Sikhs are the backbone, they say, of India, but Sikh officers cannot serve or command a Sikh battalion, a Sikh regiment after 1986. So there a big gaps gets created. It is true with all the native regiments. So there is a huge leadership failure which is involved in this entire scenario. The General Samir Ram of the Indian Army carried out a study on this, and he blamed it on the battle fatigue and stress. But there are much more to it. They didn't talk about the leadership failure I've just mentioned. They didn't talk about the cost of running an apartheid. You see, and it has got a cost on your conscience. And the soldiers are, you don't like to believe it, but they're sensitive people.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Mr. Adil Farrukh Raja, for joining us in the show today and talking to us in detail. Faisal, my last quick question would be to you. As Farrukh was pointing out, of course, that the CDS was not just a position of the CDS, it was far more than that. Do you think that then it doesn't count more than perhaps the 4 rooms that you were talking about earlier?
It is about, as
money.
It is about the money, it is about the power, it is about the thirst of power, hunger of power. And one more thing I wanted to, saffronization of the Indian Army, as we have been seeing, that the officers that are waiting their their promotions, they know the facts that as long as they attach or associate themselves with the RSS or with the BJP, they have a fair chance of getting promoted.
Absolutely.
Otherwise, they won't be getting promoted.
Yes.
Can I
quickly.
very quickly?
Yes.
Regarding something that was asked earlier about demoralization, frankly, how do you think a force is not going to be demoralized when it was built, its character was built as a secular force, which absorbs Hindus, Muslims, Christians, Sikhs and all, and then RSS is given unfettered access as it was done under General Rawat. When it happens, they see their own brothers being declared non-nationals in Assam, their own brothers being killed in Delhi, then Sikhs being declared that they are all, Khalistani. When that happens, the service morale is going to go down.
Absolutely.
And then, of course, it doesn't trickle down to the common soldier.
Yes, Farrukh, we're out of time now. Of course, that is true. The man will probably change in the position of the CDS, but what we really hope is real change in terms of what the military represents and what the government wants to put forward. That's all from the debate. Thanks a lot for watching.